So these seminars focus on the status and multidimensional dynamics of inequality in the African continent and aim to contribute research and policy perspectives on this. Each seminar is informed by chapters that ACEIR researchers and associates published in the book Inequalities in Sub-Saharan Africa, Multidimensional Perspectives and Future Challenges. And the book was published by the World Bank and the AFD in January 2025. So today's seminar draws on two chapters from the book. The first chapter that frames this seminar is on migration and inequality, authored by Under David and Rawan Yasser from the AFD, and Murray Leibbrandt and Muna Shifa from ACEIR and SALRU. And then the contributors to the other chapter on social mobility and the persistence of inequality are Murray, Rawan, and then we also have Robert Osei from the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research in the University of Ghana. And we also have, as an author for that chapter, Mike Savage from the London School of Economics. So for today's speakers, we have Muna Shifa, is a senior researcher in SALRU and a member of the South African node of the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research. Her research focuses on land tenure systems and rural livelihoods, urbanization and development, social cohesion and inequality, and the analysis of poverty and inequality. She also teaches postgraduate level courses on complex surveys and measuring poverty and inequality at the UCT School of Economics. The second presenter is Murray Leibbrandt, who holds the UCT Research Chair in Poverty and Inequality Research at SALRU and is the director of ACEIR. He was also Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Poverty and Inequality at UCT and SALRU's director between 2013 and 2023. His research focuses on the use of survey data, particularly longitudinal studies, to explore poverty, inequality, and labor market dynamics in South Africa and across Africa. So the first presenter will be Muna. So Muna.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Susan said, today's talk involves two chapters from the multidimensional inequality analysis in sub-Saharan Africa. So in the first part, I will discuss inequality and migration relationships. So as the previous seminars, the book provides an overview of or what we learn about the different dimensions of inequalities and the drivers of inequality and the consequences of inequality. So we don't present new results or data analysis. So what we are presenting is like the summary of findings, for example, in terms of what we know about inequality and migration in Africa, and also what we know about social mobility inequality in Africa. So starting from the outline, I will start talking about migration inequality relationships. Of course, the relationship between migration inequality is a very complex, dynamic, and context dependent. So we will not able to cover like in detail everything, but we can highlight and summarize what we understand on how inequality affects migration, or how also migration affects inequality, because the relationship is in two ways. So I will start also reflecting about, okay, why do we care about migration to begin with? Then Murray will take over and speak about social mobility and inequality. Okay, so why do we care about migration? So as we know, migration is, when we talk about migration, we are talking about migration, both internal migration. Migration happens within countries from rural to urban areas, which is the most common form of migration. And we are also talking about migration across borders, like within African countries, people can migrate from one African country to another African country, or they can migrate from Africa to the rest of the world. So when we talk about migration, we are reflecting about both type of migrations. So internal migration is an integral part of structural transformation and development in many countries. Especially we can find this if we look at development patterns of developed countries, migration contributes to the movement of people from low agricultural productivity sector to higher productive sectors to manufacturing and service sector employment. This facilitates productivity growth and economic efficiency and economic growth in developed countries. Of course, this might not be the case when we look at the evidence in African countries and some developing countries, and this is because the migration process involves largely based on not necessarily pull factors like increased productivity in urban areas or expansion of manufacturing sectors, but push factors are contributing more to migration of people from rural areas to urban areas, which have limitation in terms of contribute to increasing productivity and economic efficiency. So structural transformation in Africa also very limited. Still, large share of the population stays in rural areas with subsistence agriculture as the main source of employment. So if migration is managed properly, it can contribute to structural transformation and economic development and economic efficiency. Migration also an important means to mitigate various shocks or deal with or cope with various shocks. There are evidences which show that migration can be used as a means to deal with trade-related shocks, globalization, or conflict or climate-related shocks. So when communities face such kind of trends, people can migrate to better areas or less affected areas in order to deal or cope with such kind of shocks. Another important role of migration is given that people try to migrate from less developed areas to better developed areas, they can have better access to labor market in jobs and also access to different services. So through this process, they can reduce both income and multidimensional poverties. So this can contribute to achieving the various sustainable development goals we are aiming to achieve. The other important role of migration is especially international migration is becoming the key source of external finance for many low and middle-income countries. We can see this from the following graph. For example, we can see in both sides of the graph on the left-hand side of the graph, we can see remittance from international migration, global figure for 2023, while on the right-hand side of the graph, we can see financial flows from international remittance to Africa in 2024. As we can see that over time, financial flows from remittance is overtaking other sources of external finance, such as aid and foreign direct investment. So if we look at, for example, the estimate for Africa, in 2024, about 95 billion US dollar comes to Africa through international remittance, while the corresponding figure from international aid is about 73 billion US dollar. The figure from remittance is also very close to the estimate from financial flow from foreign direct investment. In fact, this estimate of remittance for Africa can be very much underestimated because the estimate only captures remittance through formal means. While in many African countries, informal means of supplying remittance can constitute about from 40 to 80% of the formal remittance. So considering that, we can argue that actually financial flow through remittance can be higher than with foreign direct investment. So it's important to kind of leverage the migration and remittances for development purposes. This is particularly important for Africa, given that African countries face significant financial gaps. So if you look at the recent estimate for Africa to achieve structural transformation and sustainable development goals, the annual financial gap reaches about 420 million US dollar. So I think it's critical to think about how to leverage migration for development in Africa. However, there are significant inequalities in terms of who receives remittance from international migration. In African context, despite there is a significant growth over time in the amount of remittance received, the large share of remittance goes to like countries in the Northern African countries, such as Egypt, Morocco, and in the Western African countries, such as Nigeria, Ghana, kind of dominate the remittance going to the different countries. So there are kind of reflect different opportunities and constraints across countries from benefiting from remittance. So looking at patterns of internal and international migration, what we find is that the most prevalent type of migration in Africa is internal migration, especially from rural to urban area migration is most prevalent. However, unfortunately, there is very limited data which provides comprehensive kind of migration, internal migration data in Africa. I think the latest available data goes back to like 2005. So there is a limitation in terms of actually understanding how much the migration in Africa is internal migration. But the different estimates from different countries indicate that rural to urban migration is the most prevalent migration pattern in Africa. And when we look at international or cross-border migration, we can say that intra-African migration is becoming more important. So we can see this from the graph on the left and on the right-hand side. The blue line indicates migrants who are originated from Africa but migrating to the outside African continent, while the green line indicates migrants who are born in Africa while migrated into other African countries, which reflects within African migration. While the rate, the international migrants coming to Africa is very small amount. So what we can see from the graph is over time, intra-African migration is becoming an important part of international migration. So if you look at the intra-Africa remittance amount is, for 2024, it's about 19 billion US dollar, which constitutes about 25% of total remittance, internal remittance to Africa. So it's important, this reflects the importance of like harnessing also within African migrations. So when we look at the key drivers of migration, there are different factors which contribute to migration, contributes to or drives migration in African context. Inequality is one of the factors. Obviously, that if there is differences in wage or opportunities in terms of access to basic services, people tend to migrate. Conflict and war is also very important. Many African countries now, conflict and war are kind of becoming a recurrent event. So, of course, it's dynamic, it varies from country to country, but it's becoming also an important factor for driving migration. Climate change impacts are also an important factor. This is because, of course, in many African countries, the large share of the population relies in climate-sensitive economic activities. So whenever there's droughts and recurrent floodings, people migrate. Even this could be within countries, within country migration, it drives internal migration. The other one, discrimination based on like gender, race, can also drive migration. So the combination of these different factors contributes for the pattern of migration we observe. However, the ability to migrate is not the same for everybody, even if like we have inequalities or conflict or even if there is climate change impacts, not everybody able to migrate. This depends based on the cost of migration, whether people have the resources to migrate or the networks they're able to like find in the destination areas. And also policies also play a significant role. For example, in some countries, land policies can play a role in terms of whether people are able to migrate or not. If, for example, people don't have access to land titling, people might reluctant to migrate due to scarce. They might scare like, okay, if I migrate, I might lose my land or my resources. So they might stay in their land despite low productivity or face climate change impacts. So the cost and policies contribute whether people migrate or able to migrate. So migration, of course, what it provides both an opportunity and also it provides some challenges. Yeah? So we have to kind of able to balance the two. It's like we cannot like really manage necessarily migration, but we can kind of use or leverage migration to kind of have a positive impact while minimizing the negative impact. So one of the impact of migration is its relationship with inequality. So that's the focus also of the chapter. So when the relationship can go both ways, migration can drive inequality. It can increase inequality or reduce inequality depending on the context, but also the other way around is inequality can also drive migration. So when looking at how inequality affects migration, one of the key factors is the presence of spatial inequality within countries in terms of wage, income, other opportunities, access to services and amenities. Within countries can drive spatial migration. This is also the same in terms of opportunities between countries. So difference in opportunities in different countries can drive migration. So the evidence shows that actually more than 80% of people who migrate move because of looking for better opportunities in destination countries or areas, which is higher wage and access to better services. The other one is if there are high inequalities within communities, origin communities, or within countries, this can also increase relative deprivation. Even if people are doing better off in terms of absolute deprivation, relative deprivation can also drive migration through the aspiration rates. So people might migrate if there is high level of inequality. Obviously, initially the better off might migrate to better off areas, but on the long term also the poor also might migrate over time as like migration networks have increased in destination areas. The other one is environmentally induced inequality. This is another dimension of inequality. So other than the differences in wage or incomes, in many African countries, we can also have now increasingly there are environmentally induced inequalities. So climate change disproportionately affects the poor. So this creates climate-related inequalities. Because of this, people can migrate. The other dimension of inequality is political and social inequality. I mentioned it earlier. Like discrimination based on religion or race or gender or political view can make people kind of excluded from their society or from within their countries, and so it can drive also migration. So this different dimension of inequalities can drive migration. When it comes to how also inequality affects, how migration affects inequality, this depends on the understanding that migrants are not random people. So there's kind of selection based on skills level. In general, the better skilled individuals or better educated individuals tend to migrate first. And in terms of age, young people tend to migrate, male tend to migrate than female. In terms of resources, also like relatively better off individuals tend to migrate. So this can have different impacts depending on who is migrating on inequality or other welfare outcomes. So we can look at the impact of migration by looking at how it affects origin communities and how it affects also destination countries and communities. So inequality affects origin communities or countries through two key channels. One is remittance. So remittance flows from destination regions or areas to local origin areas can either create or reduce inequality or increase inequality depending who is migrating. So if better off individuals are the one who migrate more, then this can create inequality in origin countries and origin areas. But this can also, in the long term, can adjust. Then if policies facilitate migration of disadvantaged people, and if also through time, as migration networks kind of expand, like the poor also might able to migrate, then it might reduce inequalities depending on if the poor are disproportionately benefit from remittances. So it depends on who's migrating and also whether the impact is going to be in the long term or we are looking at the short term impact of migration. The other one is labor market impact. Out migration can reduce pressure in local labor markets. So it might reduce unemployment. So this can also increase wages in origin areas. Then this can obviously can contribute to higher wages in origin areas and reduce inequality. But this can also, like out migration can also associate with brain drain, where we can, like origin countries or areas can lose skilled labor. This might negatively contribute to local development in terms of losing skilled labor. So this might reduce demand in local areas, which can also exacerbate inequality between regions in a given country or between countries. So for example, in 2018, almost 25% of doctors trained in sub-Saharan Africa were working in OECD countries. So this can have significant impact in terms of losing skilled labor. However, the net impact depends whether remittance can kind of mitigate the loss of skill in origin countries, and also whether how the labor market adjusts over time to the lost skill. So it's also dependent on how the labor market adjusts. When it comes to the effect on destination countries, this is also a very complex kind of relationship. So, for example, if we look at within countries, spatial inequalities, movement of people to urban areas can improve living condition of migrants, but this depends also who is migrating. If, like, for example, disadvantaged people are more likely to migrate in urban areas without providing access to enough basic services, this can create spatial inequalities in urban areas. I think we observe this in many developing countries. There is high level of spatial inequalities within urban areas. In many cases, also when we look at migration related to conflict, climate change, etc., these are non-voluntary migration patterns. So this can contribute to spatial inequalities even within urban areas. So in general, in the context of destination countries, of course, migrants can contribute to the development of destination countries, but depends also whether they are low-skilled migrants or they're high-skilled migrants. For example, if they're high-skilled migrants, they can contribute to local economy. They can also drive the relative wage of low-skilled workers, which can contribute to reduction of inequality. But if the migrants are low-skilled workers, this can also create competition in local destination labor markets. Housing prices can be also affected, and public service can be limited. So this can reduce or increase inequalities or create some segregation with destination countries. And this can also create some kind of social tension and perceived inequalities. So in general, the context and who is migrating matters in terms of the relationship between migration and inequality. So to summarize, migration in sub-Saharan Africa is double-edged. So it offers a critical pathway to increase income, reduce poverty, and improve human capital. But also, it can also contribute to increasing spatial inequality and within spatial inequality within communities and between countries. So we need to kind of have policies to kind of benefit from migration while minimizing the negative impact of migration. So among the policy discussions which kind of we have in the literature is we need to kind of combine both place-based policies and also individual-based policies, which can facilitate and migration. For example, some of the policy discussions involves investing in origin and destination countries. So investing in origin areas can increase, like investing, for example, in education, health, human capital development can limit migration, which is based on like push factor migrations. So people can stay in their area and reduce spatial inequalities. Investing in destination areas, such as investing in housing and access to basic services in urban areas, can minimize spatial inequality or urban within urban inequalities in destination areas. The other one is making migration safe and productive is important, because in many African countries, especially migration to other countries involves unsafe or informal pathways. This can be managed by having like formal, improving legal and formal migration processes. The other policy which is important in terms of benefiting from migration is targeted social protection and remittance leveraging policies. This involves, for example, in some countries they devise social protection policies and use remittances together with government subsidies to kind of develop local development in origin areas. So, for example, Mexico uses this policy of subsidizing or matching every $1 remittance received to local areas by kind of providing $3 for every dollar. So doing such kind of encouragement can be useful to leverage benefits from remittances. The other one is gender sensitive policies are important. So addressing specific barriers faced by women, like legal protection is very important, given that the women tend to be women migrants tend to be exploited in many countries. So it's important to have kind of improve the legal protections available for them, access to finance, and also childcare facilities can help migration of women between countries. The other one is data and monitoring. one of the issues of analyzing migration and inequality relationship is very limited data available, especially to understand internal migration, the dynamic of internal migration in many African countries. So it's important to have or strengthen the data system for migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna.
So the reason why we cobbled together these two chapters is because they're the most obvious or prevalent chapters in the book that illustrate people trying to be proactive in carving out better livelihoods for themselves. So obviously migration is a very physical thing, and the ability to move to opportunity, to use the current expression about social mobility, about migration, it's a movement to opportunity, and understanding who can do it and who can't is an important part of understanding how life is really working for people. And I think maybe that's the organizing framework of this book of ours. It's got a lot of detail in it about all sorts of stuff. We heard last session on the book from Vimal about education in the labor market, and he did a really good job of showing how they interact collectively and to lead to certain outcomes that enable people to get ahead or fall behind. And the social mobility chapter then extends this physical movement thing to an understanding of who's able to get ahead and who's not able to get ahead and who's falling behind and why. So that's the focus of that chapter. So collectively, they make the case about how life is really working for people on the continent. Not how policymakers are saying it's working, how it's actually working. What's the evidence? So here's a slide about why this is regarded as important in a book on inequality. This is a picture about something called the Great Gatsby curve. It's Alan Kruger, the late Alan Kruger, cooked up this curve in the context of Obama's America, where inequality was going through the roof, and he wanted to see what was what the impact of that was, of certain people doing so much better than other people for the opportunities that people had to get ahead. And that's what the Gatsby curve shows. He showed it for America across states. This is a cross-country Great Gatsby curve, and we've got inequality at the bottom, and so higher levels of inequality are associated with lower levels of mobility, right? A higher persistence. That's what going up the y-axis is higher persistence, and so there's a link between inequality and mobility, but it's not an easy link. And we're still all battling with it, but it's an area that we think is absolutely central, and we're planning to take ahead. So all I'm going to do, and that's widely regarded, everybody's come to realize this, but in some senses I think that we're ahead of the game, because this has always been an important focus of ours in our country, in South Africa, and it's now becoming increasingly important across the continent too. I give you one's our book, the little advertorial on my left, and one's a recent December World Bank publication that even look at the title, Addressing Structural Inequalities. Okay, the focus is to address poverty reduction, and I'll come back to that. I think that's a bit limiting, but nonetheless, the book is very brave at confronting the fact that life, it's not just about what people choose to do. That's not how African development is happening right now. And inequality is important to that. How do I change this guy? Yeah, it worked once, but then it didn't. Okay. Here's why it's important. I stole this from the World Bank book. Okay. And what is this? It's a graph of structural sources of inequality. What percentage of the inequality, if you like, in consumption is explained by your birth circumstances, in particular where you're born and what your education levels of your parents, etc. This is within the literature on inequalities of opportunity. And the graph basically makes a case that in almost every country, more than half of the inequality is due to inequalities in opportunity, things that you get depending on where you're born. And that resonates completely with Muna's section on migration, right? Because in some senses, where you're born carries with it a lot of things that can be very constraining of you. Okay, I offended somebody. Why is that crucial? Why is this understanding of the fact that people have very constrained opportunities to make the most of what they have and be as productive as they can possibly be? Why that's important? Just one example with regard to Africa. On this graph, we have what's called a growth poverty elasticity. In other words, what does this measure? That measures the responsiveness of poverty reduction to growth. When you grow, you expect poverty to go down. But that's not a trivial relationship. It depends upon the texture of society and whether people are able to leverage those opportunities. And the crucial point here to make is that Africa has by far the lowest return on economic growth in terms of poverty reduction of any other context around the world. And to some extent, I think that our book makes a contribution to understanding, well, what's the texture of African societies that makes that the situation? How come? Obviously, in an extreme inequality society like South Africa, well, each increment of growth accrues, more than 60% of that accrues to the top 10% of the income distribution. So that's not exactly an inclusive growth process. But in other African countries, even with lower levels of inequality, the texture of the inequality is such that it's very hard for them to be inclusive. I'm using up all my time in motivating, but that's okay. I'll blitz through all the other stuff. I'll have to keep an eye on the time now. So there's two themes in the mobility literature. There's two different perspectives. There's an intergenerational mobility perspective, and the chapter's organized like this. Intergenerational, that's you compared to your parents. In some senses, it's like every country, it's got to be it's certainly the American dream, certainly the South African dream, that your children's life will be better than yours. And the study of intergenerational mobility looks at that, and it's a very good long-run metric on the progress of a society, or the progress of people in a society. Is life better for your children than for you? So here's some evidence about Africa in particular. And African children, especially girls, have the lowest probability of surpassing their parents' education of those in any world region. So it's a bit like the growth elasticity. As Vimal detailed last time, and as the book details, there's been a lot of progress in terms of educational progression in the continent. You know, a more free education, etc., etc. But this is a sort of an aggregate statistic that just puts that into some perspective. And certainly that's not the case in South Africa, right? But the texture of the South African case is very telling, where we've pushed the intergenerational education mobility has pushed young people into much higher levels of education than their parents. But those zones are into incomplete secondary schooling for many. And as we heard in the last seminar, that doesn't turn out well for the younger generation. This is a test for you, whether you were really listening in the last seminar. I stole this slide from Vimal. It is just his inequality trap diagram. That shows how complicated getting improving educational outcomes don't necessarily lead to improved income outcomes, earnings outcomes, labor market outcomes, anything else, development outcomes in general. It's a complicated process. And in South Africa, we showed, and our work shows, that that the intergenerational mobility, occupational mobility, is way, way lower than the educational mobility. In other words, people don't move into better occupations than their parents. And this graph just shows the income or earnings mobility is also way lower, in fact, stunningly lower, especially at the bottom and at the top, where it's world-beatingly, what's the right word, immobile. You know, right at the bottom, the transmission of disadvantage is so strong that kids have got a 95% chance of being in the same labor market position as their parents. At the top, it's transmission of advantage with right up to 70% of you. If your parents are in a very good occupation, that you've got more than a 70% chance of also being there. So this is found across the country. Well, let me take a step back. So most of the work on intergenerational mobility in Africa has been on educational mobility, on that first phase. There's quite a lot of work now. And I'll just give you one study here, which is quite a famous one by Alessina and others in Econometrica, that basically just studies intergenerational educational mobility using census data sets, and it looks at primary school completion, and it shows quite a lot of mobility, but quite a lot of variation in that mobility too. But the key point is that you get more mobility if your parents are better educated. That's the sort of punchline of this study. So your parents' starting point, the starting point of your parents impacts also on your ability to improve. So there's some sort of threshold point at which parents, that you can do better than your parents. But that's unequal itself. The study, excellent study, makes a lot of key points that link very much to what Muna was saying about these outcomes also depend on lots of other things, like your community infrastructure, things that government provides to you to enable people to do better. It's not just, you know, there's nothing inexorable about this, but there's lots of variation across countries, within countries, urban, rural. The study spends a lot of time looking at districts within countries. This is just an example of Ghana. And you can see huge differences in mobility in different parts of Ghana. So it's just representative of the now big body of work across the continent about educational mobility. That's because it's easier to do. The data can do it. Here's one other study that I'll just bring to you. There are many others. What's important about this study is it shows what we showed in South Africa, that the educational mobility doesn't translate easily into occupational mobility. There's a complicated social texture to that you need to understand if you're going to see how life's really working for people. And again, it's dependent a lot on infrastructure, on rural versus urban, and all sorts of social things too. So there's a huge literature, and a lot of our graduate students around here are working on this intergenerational mobility issue. We've got a big project working with the University of Ghana because they have the type of data that we need, also doing these type of studies. Okay, I'll blitz through this. I'll give myself 5 minutes. Is that okay? So what then about intragenerational mobility? What is that? That's just tracking the same people over time and working out in real time, how's their life gone over the last decade or over the last 3 years, etc. It's very different to a perspective on society that says the unemployment rate is stubbornly high in South Africa, or the poverty rate is stubbornly high. It tries to understand, okay, who's poor and who's poor all the time versus who's poor now and then they're out and then they're not, or who's in the elite and are they always the same people, etc. Those sorts of dynamics. And the focus of our perspective in the book, but also in our work, has been not just on poverty dynamics. We've leaned on the poverty dynamics literature to give ourselves the tools to understand how to model this mobility. But we've insisted, as good inequality scholars, that you need to understand these dynamics across the distribution. And in fact, even to understand poverty dynamics properly, you've got to locate them and how that society is working, not just to look at the poor themselves. Okay, but nonetheless, if you've got panel data, which we have in South Africa, the National Income Dynamics Study, and Ghana has with the Ghanaian Socioeconomic Panel, and I'll come back to some other data sets, then you can model these transitions as they occur. And you can model them in a way that takes account of the data, of the fact that the world doesn't start with your first data set, right? That's the so-called initial conditions situation. And that it's panel data with attrition and all sorts of bad things. And then you can model these dynamics. And so we've done this. And so here's an example of poverty spells modeled out of NIDS. I'll just give you some of the results. This is what we've done with this type of modeling. So what are we modeling here? If the dark blue is you're always poor. 5 times out of 5, you were poor. And right up at the top, the light stuff is you were never poor. And then in between. So in our modeling, then you can work out how does that relate to the education level of the household head. And you can see that if you've got less than matric, you've got much more dark stuff, right? So you can actually begin to understand what's driving these poverty spells, or those trapped in poverty, 5 times out of 5, right? There's a gender dimension that's very strong. There's an urban-rural dimension, and the location, the quality of employment of your household head is really important. So that's what you can do with this modeling, and we're pushing this across the continent. We think this sort of modeling is very important. But as I said, we prefer to locate it in an analysis of the whole society and the dynamics in the whole society. And it turns out to be that that's really important. So this little diagram just locates the poor, the middle class, and the elite with some relationship to their probability of falling into poverty or escaping from poverty. That's what it does. That's how it builds the poverty analysis. So in the South African context, what have we done? Using NIDS, we've then modeled, okay, the size of these classes. Notice the classes. Chronically poor, you're poor all the time. Transient poor, you're in poverty for one wave, but you don't necessarily stay there. Vulnerable middle class, if you like, means you're above the poverty line at a certain point in time, but you're very vulnerable to falling back into poverty. The middle class is more stable. That you've got a lower, you've moved beyond the situation where you're likely to fall back into poverty. You're more classic middle class where you can look forward in your life. And then the elite have got poverty is the last thing on their minds. And the sizes of these things did cause some consternation in this country, especially when many people were arguing about the burgeoning black middle class and the exploding black diamonds in South Africa, because this isn't that picture, right? What the study was very valuable in showing was that that there has been a growth in the middle class, but it's much more fragile than people make out. Two, that the distinction between those just below the poverty line and just above the poverty line is quite spurious. They're almost indistinguishable in a dynamic sense. So this idea that you focus your whole policy around a measurement of the rate of poverty isn't such a good idea, because that's not how the society is working. There's a huge precariat in our country. Very useful. Where the study, and very useful in the African context too, because we had also in Africa almost tautological definitions of the middle class, where you took some section of the income distribution and defined that as the middle class, and then somehow you worked out, well, you know, the people in that band are, that people in that income band are growing. And then you argued, okay, so the size of the middle class, look at the red here. The red is increasing quite dramatically. And at one stage, there was a bit of hubris about that. And it didn't serve anybody well, because the story coming out of our book is that African societies are much more like the South African, not necessarily with our extreme inequality, but with this precariat class in the middle. What we're calling the middle class aren't really usefully regarded as middle class. So we've used the National Income Dynamic Study. We're working on the Ghanaian socioeconomic panel, the two best national panels in the continent. It's a big part of our work and big part of the evidence in the book, actually. There are other panel data sets. The World Bank has produced a few, and they're available online, about 6 from their living standards measurement surveys. There's a long-term there are some specific regional panel data sets around the continent. Kagera in Tanzania is one good example that's been used a lot. There's a new Mozambican mobility study. If you're going to understand mobility, you often need quite peculiar questions. Like, we can't do the type of work that Raj Chetty does. We can't do it on the continent right now, because we can't link enough information about where your parents' situation, where you were born, what that meant, and now your situation, and etc. We can't do it. So you've got to produce some specialist instruments, but we can do quite well, as hopefully I've shown you. Not too bad. What I wanted to also advertise a bit, because I'm pushing now onto the forward agenda. This is a very important part of our work going forward. We think it's an important contribution to the African inequality discussion. There's a number of, well, there's 2 major studies that have produced a collection of what's called synthetic panel data, basically cohorts, linked cohorts from survey data. So here's one paper that I'm just flagging that summarizes a big project that produced a number of African synthetic panel data sets. Peter Lagneau and Van Top, but it was a big project called DEEP. I can't remember what DEEP stands for, but Deep into Poverty, for sure. And the analysis was about poverty in the paper, but the synthetic cohorts aren't just about the poor. Here's another one. The World Bank has been pushing very hard into this area. They've got about 27 African countries where they produce synthetic panel. And so we're busy engaging with the World Bank about a very large project that we're hoping to do that can analyze mobility in Africa using all the data we have, including their synthetic panel data. Here's the problem with all of this survey-based stuff. It runs out of steam when it comes to the elite. It just doesn't do a great job. Even the methodology of looking at the chances of people falling into poverty doesn't really make any sense if you want to analyze dynamics around the elite. And so, like in South Africa, as I said before, if the elite are scooping a large chunk of total income, it becomes really important to understand those elite dynamics for tax policy, but even for how the society hangs together. So what we need to do something about that. It's not just voyeurism to look at the top end of the distribution. It's important to any African country where a lot of your tax revenues don't come to the tax authority. They're not tax revenues. They're potential tax revenues. They're going out of the country because of the behavior of people at the top end of the income distribution. So in South Africa, we've had the privilege of having access to tax data. I'll be very quick here. I just want to flag this as a new frontier that's crucial to Raj Chetty's type of work. You can connect administrative data, census data to data from the revenue authorities, and then you can start connecting people's livelihoods over time. In South Africa, we have a tax lab, as I know. That's a free infomercial to the National Treasury and SA Tide, who've got this project, UNU WIDER. I'm just giving you one slide here from work that Chandra Jacobs at the back there and myself and others have done. It just shows you that you can actually get at some of the capital incomes through the tax data that you can't get at from other data. And it's a panel, right? Because it's the same people who are paying taxes every year. So you can trace their progress over time. We've started looking at the dynamics at the top end of the income distribution in a way that you just couldn't do with the data sets I've discussed before. Okay. Quick point about policy. I'll make it with one slide. It's the punchline, really. What's the point of all this analysis? We think it's a very important part of our work in ACEIR, and a part of our work in the book is it's a synthesizing thing that pulls together all these other components of inequality. You know, where you live for sure, but also your education and how the labor market's actually working, your household dynamics, your community dynamics. It pulls it together in a way that enables you to say, okay, how's life actually working for people? And the concluding chapters in the book make quite a lot of this framework, because they talk about climate change and a sustainable society and who has adaptive capacity or who has resilience. There's a chapter on that. And that's the same discussion that we're talking about now. Who can actually respond to something that happens? Muna was talking about floods and migration. But there's floods and response and your livelihoods when many African societies are still at least 50% rural. And the informal sector is very important. Anyway, so this is a diagram from the World Bank study, because I'm going to the sort of more conservative voice than the ACEIR voice to show you that even there's an acknowledgement that you need to look at how these things all fit together. It harkens back to Wimmel's diagram. In order to make a policy to enable people to actually make their livelihoods better. Where our book actually does push a bit beyond the World Bank book is in this intergenerational focus that makes it very clear that history still is important in any African context, and harder to measure things are very important. There's no mechanical relationship here that you've actually got to understand how it works in your country to know how to intervene. And we'll have a session on gender. It's coming. This is a scene from a forthcoming attraction. That comes back to these harder issues like norms and their role in all of this, because it's not just about infrastructure. Infrastructure is crucial, and a key policy point that we make out of this mobility literature is that there's no magic bullet. Education is not a magic bullet. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it has to align with an understanding of what else is constraining people's lives in order to think through a policy package that's going to work. And in order to respect how life is actually working for people. Thanks.
Thank you, Murray. It is 2 o'clock, so for those who need to leave, you're free to do so. But if you have any comments or questions, you can raise your hand and I'll give you the mic. Jermaine, any questions online?
Sorry for slamming you with such a long.
Sorry, it's very interesting. There's a hand up. There's one hand up.
Slide that you showed, what was the y-axis which showed the green Gatsby line?
The y-axis was then the intergenerational mobility. So you had inequality on the x. No, most unequal was on the right-hand side. Let me pull it up. Oh, it's gone. Yeah. So the y-axis was a correlation of immobility, actually. So the higher up you got, the less mobile your society was, right? So what you saw was you get increasing inequality going this way, and you get less mobility going up. And what you saw was the higher the levels of inequality, the less the mobility.
So what social mobility, what was it like? The difference between parents' income and the subject's income?
It was actually something called a intergenerational earnings elasticity, as far as I remember.
What's the foundation of that? What goes into that measure? It's income?
Yes.
Across 2 generations.
Labor market income in particular. Yes.
But across 2 generations.
Yes. Exactly. And so so there's quite a lot of studies within this very building, actually, around South Africa's intergenerational earnings mobility. Because it's not so easy. I understand the question you're asking, because it's not so easy to do, because you've got to somehow capture kids at an equivalent comparable point to their parents. So if you've got a long run panel data set, like the panel study of income dynamics in the US, that's been going since 1967, you can actually do it in the panel. You can do it literally. But what most of these studies do is you've either got to predict what parents would have earned at say you take 30 years old as your cutoff for your kids. You've got to predict what parents would have earned at that same age, but in the contemporary labor market, in a sense. Or you've got to go the other way and predict what kids would have earned when parents were earning. That's how those studies work. But they're not that complicated, actually, in terms of the actual regressions you're running. Maybe it's hubris or something, but it's not a complicated econometric model. It's just obviously it's got education there that's very important, and not a whole lot of other controls.
We have 2 people online. Felina, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
And Muna can answer too, of course.
Felina?
So she's saying
There were other questions at the back. Should I take one for so long?
Oh, I found it. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
cool.
Oh, okay. So my question was about the slide that you showed about, I think it was education, labor, and skills. And so my question is around the skills economy, because if the education system, so say universities producing skills, for example, the majority is humanities, and the labor market, there's skills shortages. So what does that look like for the future of, say, developing our skills in our country? Bearing in mind that, how do I put this? We still need to be competitive, I guess, globally. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Makes
Right.
perfect sense. I don't know whether Muna wants to answer that question.
Yeah.
Muna?
So if I understand the question properly, so how is it like how we invest in education and skills level to improve
Yeah.
Okay.
returns?
So yes, basically, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a critical point, like a critical kind of investment that we need in Africa.
Yeah.
So in terms of like, if we have to move forward in improving livelihoods, we have to, I think, the key points, of course, to improve education on science and technology and humanities. You need both, especially there is kind of very limited skills in science and technology. So we need to, like, there's actually a move now to kind of accelerate the production of graduate students in science and technology. So we need to invest in both skills in order actually like develop local economy and also benefit from, for example, even if we do migration abroad, improve the skill kind of have more better return. Yeah. So I think it's a critical kind of step.
But I mean, if I can add just a bit. So in Africa, think of an African context, right? Where what are you expecting skill to do what exactly? Right? In most African countries, the formal sectors are maybe 30% of the economy. And so there's large other things, informal activity, rural farm, non-farm things. So the evidence on that issue is, yes, we definitely need a capacity to develop our own technology, et cetera, that high-end stuff, the STEM stuff. We need it, but as important for the general citizenry to cope with whatever is quality, whatever we're doing, right? Quality primary, secondary schooling, even analytic ability at the university level. It's equally important. Trevor Manuel calls this adaptive capacity writ large, not just in a climate change context. He said we're not in a world of planning anymore. The world is falling apart in terms of long run secure. We need the ability to adapt. And that's what we need. And so what is going to give people the education to be able to do that? And it's definitely, we need some STEM, we do need STEM capacity, particularly in the ability to adapt our own circumstances to the needs of the broader economy and the global economy. But we also need people to have the ability to adapt. And that's just not technical skills, it's more than that.
Can we take one question from the room?
Yeah, I had a question about one of the earlier metrics you used, maybe an unfair question because I think it's from the World Bank, but a graph that you used that attributed inequality either to inequality of opportunity or to other sources of more individual inequality. How does one attribute, how do you differentiate between the two?
Yeah, that's really an excellent question. And it's a question that's basically, so it depends on who you are, right? In my view, it more or less makes this inequality of opportunity versus inequality of they've got stuff in brackets, right? Where they said effort, stuff. They were trying not to, for a while it was just regarded as effort and individual drive and all of that sort of stuff. You can't do it satisfactorily. But the models have got more and more complicated in trying to, cope with all of these intersections in the way inequality actually works. I don't think it's wholly successful. So that's not really, I think it's really good in making a point to people, right? Like where you were born is going to determine your outcomes. But it's far less successful in being a bit more specific about that. And it tends to, people then tend to say, okay, but you know, we've got a bunch of lazy guys that just aren't working very hard around. There's all this, there's 40, even if it's only 40%, there's all this 40%, like what are these guys doing? They're sitting around, you know, they don't actually want to work or whatever. And, you know, maybe there's some people like that, but that's not what the technique does. It's a residual. Once you've controlled for these where you were born effects, the rest is the residual. And I think that's almost like dangerous, given that it's playing into very complicated theories of justice and things like that.
Helen, your hand was up. Will you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Mainly I wanted to say hi and thank you for the seminar. And I've been skimming the book, which looks great, and I look forward to reading it in greater detail. But I did have a question that I wanted to ask on the migration inequality topic, because I think, you know, we all, for a while now, we think either in terms of international migration, from which most people think of migration from African countries to elsewhere, or internal migration, which then becomes a bit blurred as to whether that's referring to purely domestic migration within a country or internal migration to the international within the African continent. And I found that distinction even from the book, and I was just glancing over it a little, you know, you treat within Africa migration kind of more as a form of internal migration. But as diversity, as African countries sort of like diversifying in terms of their economic performance, I almost wonder if it's more of a kind of, you know, becoming almost like a European Union kind of thing, where movement between African countries is kind of leveling this off. And that led me to my question, which is how do we think about migrants from one African country to another in terms of inequality? Because if someone, for example, migrates from Malawi or Zambia to South Africa, they're going to be in the bottom of the income distribution in South Africa most of the time, and it's going to make the inequality figures for South Africa look worse. And we're going to think, okay, that's a bad thing. But then relative to those whom they left behind in the country from where they came from, they will be at the upper end of the distribution, and were their income to instead be factored into the the Zambian Gini coefficient calculation or whatever, it would actually be inequality reducing. So how do we kind of conceptualize this in a way that maybe I won't even finish my question, but I think you get my point, yeah. Right? How do we think of that?
Muna, that's for you.
Okay, thanks for the question. So I think regarding the first point, whether we are looking at how do we classify like people are moving within African countries originated from African countries, I think that's considered like in part of international migration or cross-border migration. When we say internal migration, we are referring migration within countries. So when migration within South Africa, from urban to rural areas, or from one region to another region, that's internal migration. Maybe out in the future, if there is kind of integration of African countries into kind of one unit, maybe then we can change the definition. I don't know. I don't know how we it's going to like migration within like European countries. Do we say it like it's internal migration or not? I'm not sure about that. But I think at the moment, when we refer to international migration, it includes migrants within African countries, as long as it is cross-border migration. Regarding the impact on inequality, it is a complex question. Like we don't have like an answer like inequality can be increased in South Africa if people migrate, for example, from Malawi. It depends who is migrating, as we said. Like if the migrants from Malawi are low-skilled migrants, and if they have also, if in South Africa, they also settle in like informal jobs, informal employment, definitely they can contribute to higher increase inequality, spatial inequality. But if the migrants are high-skilled workers from migrating from Malawi, they can contribute to the local economy. Yeah, they can increase productivity, etc. Then they can reduce inequality in the destination country. So it depends. Like, that's why it's very complex and specific, like context specific, and also it's kind of a dynamic. So we cannot have an answer like whether there is kind of a definite answer, inequality will increase or decrease. It depends on who is migrating and who's not migrating. I hope I answered the question.
Can I just, I think that was exactly right. But where I think there's an evidence gap is I think that you're raising a very good issue, Callum. And where there's an evidence gap is actually the impact of the migrants into South Africa, for example. Like certainly the EU literature was quite definitive. I don't know when, but 8 years ago, it was just a ton of research about how each European country benefited from these migrants. But it certainly didn't shape the popular discourse, right? And I think that sort of research is absolutely crucial in South Africa. I haven't seen a lot of good research of that sort in South Africa, and imagine how useful that would be. As Muna was saying, there's the potential for the country to benefit greatly from those sorts of migrants. But obviously our unemployment rate makes that very complicated in this country and very easy for manipulation by populace, as happened in Europe, right? Where this weight of evidence just got nowhere, really.
There's one online question that we, for the sake of equality, needs to ask. It's Celeste asking, from the analysis, are there some insight into some of the key aspects of the texture of South Africa's society that keep inequality so entrenched?
Oh, what a glorious question. I would like to say yes, of course. In some senses, I think that's what I was, big picture, I was trying to motivate why we think the study of mobility is so important. Because it actually tries to answer that question, right? And on the downside, where I finished my ruminations at the end, was that by looking at how inequality persists and mobility persists, you almost move away from easy answers, right? There's some obvious lessons. That the most important one being that people use whatever opportunities you open up for them to the fullest. So improved education, by me saying education is not a magic bullet. I'm not saying people won't, if you improve the education system, people will use it, for sure. All I'm saying is that intersects, for example, with the texture of your community, your ability to do well in school doesn't just depend upon sorting out the teachers and the curriculum and stuff. You walk out of a certain door every day when you go to school. And the quality of what happens in your household and the quality of your community is also important to your school performance. And so that's what makes it difficult. So I have a personal position on this, which I argue all the time in government, that it actually leads to quite conservative policy making, but around a cluster of policies. You need to decide what are your priority things that you have to get right and forget the rest. Like leverage the budget towards things that are going to work with people, enable people to do the job, right? Not you promise to deliver a better South Africa. You've got to realize that a better South Africa is going to be built by our people. But then they need some foundational things in place. So I think there's 4 or 5 things that are absolutely crucial and very complicated, cute active labor market policies, for example, that presume that the labor market works in a certain way are probably not the way to go, because when people are trying to get ahead, they know what's going on, right? And they would prefer to have decent foundational education so that they can do the best they can. So it leads me into quite a conservative space, but not a magic bullet type of a space.
Can we have one last question?
I just have a question on, I think at the end of the slides by Muna, there was like a recommendation about the data limitations when doing migration studies. So I think also it becomes even difficult when you're trying to, let's say, narrow your study about migration. Let's say you're studying rural urban migration in South Africa. You tend to find out that you have data that has very few observations. So I wanted to find out, like, if there has been any thinking around overcoming this issue. Like, is it more like trying to collect more data on migration, or is it also trying to recover any lost data if there's any?
Muna, do you want to answer?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure whether I have the correct answer or not. So usually like migration analysis, especially internal migration analysis, relies on censuses. So migration information is collected in most censuses. There's some information about migration, which focuses on lifetime migration. So you have to kind of wait 10 years in order to kind of analyze migration dynamics. And that doesn't really capture what's happening between these 10 years. In some African countries, they don't even collect census in 10 years. So there's a huge gap in terms of measuring internal migration in many African countries. Now there is kind of a movement to improve and include the major migration using household surveys, which collects frequent household data sets. So they are trying to include migration modules in household surveys so that we can find relatively better migration data, internal migration data. I think someone is also in the chat kind of suggesting like South Africa, South Africa is now including migration modules to household survey data sets. So that's an important movement. I think many African countries need to do that. The other challenge is even if you have like survey data sets to measure migration, it's very difficult concept. Like people migrate frequently from one place to another place. So capturing that can be still difficult, but we can kind of improve the way we ask questions about migration. Like, for example, we can ask how many times people move from one place to another, or when they moved last time, or whether they moved before the given specific time. So we have to kind of improve the methodology to measure better migration data. I think that's my answer.
I mean, can I put in a plug for NIDS? So the National Income Dynamics Study turns out to be just a fantastic vehicle for analyzing internal migration. Useless for cross-border because as soon as people leave them, they migrate out of the study. But if they move, then the survey tracks them, spends all its money following people literally from Eastern Cape, say, to Gauteng. And then so you know which household they came from, and you know a lot about that household, and you know quite a lot about the community because you can merge in census data and stuff. And then you know a lot about where they're living when we see them again, and what they're doing, and what family they're living in, and what community they're living in. Other panel data sets globally actually aren't as great as that. Because they think of themselves as a household panel, whereas NIDS constructs a household around the individual each time. So it's just, yeah, it's just amazing for being able to answer the question. The difficulty comes in that you need a partnership with Stats.SA, for example, to merge in as much of the community information as you can from other data sources, or in this, you've got, you know which schools people are going to, or you know which clinics they're going to. So if you were getting access to the administrative data, you can add that to the pot and start talking a little bit about the quality of schooling, or the quality of healthcare. So, for example, in NIDS, there's this incredible story of this household that spends a whole lot of their income, rural KwaZulu-Natal. They spend quite a lot of their monthly income to take their kid from a quintile 1 school, which is right down the road, round the mountain, to a quintile 3 school. And you can see it in the NIDS data. There's a change of school, and you can see the change in the household expenditures, and that was before these free schooling, right? So there were school fee differences, and you can see what they're doing to make this happen. But then we do also have access to good administrative data about education, and the tragedy of South African schooling is that you really need to get up into quintile 4 or 5 schools to have a real impact on education. So you've got these people like a Gogo spending a whole pension to get their grandchild to a better school, but it's not, given the South African situation, it's not a good enough school to really unlock the opportunity, you know. It's like a tragedy almost. And there I would go back on what I was saying earlier about, I said my policy things are quite conservative because you've got to give people basic stuff. Yes, I stand by that. But you also get a very good understanding of how, from analyzing mobility, who's getting ahead, who's not, you get a very good understanding of the texture of the society. Right? So if you think about the national dialogue that everybody's yagging about right now, right? Well, what's going to be the evidence base for the national dialogue? Surely some understanding of how the society actually works. Has to be, right? And it's not a very pretty picture about how the society is actually working. It's a difficult picture that needs to be grappled with nationally.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you, Muna. And thanks to everyone who stayed until the end. As Murray mentioned, we do have another seminar in the series coming up on the 17th of September on gender inequalities in Africa, but I'm sure the communication will go out closer to that time. And this book is available on the FD website, so you're free to download it. And it comes with summaries in Swahili and isiXhosa. Yes. Yeah, so it's a really nice book. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.